Hello, everyone, and welcome to our final debate of the 59th International Affairs Symposium here at Lewis and Clark College. Our debate tonight is titled The Digital Dilemma: Does the Web Empower or Overload the Individual? And we have two incredible speakers with us today, Roslyn Fuller and Samuel Woolley. We want to thank our audience for joining, and we thank our speakers for your participation. We're honored and thrilled to have you here.
Roslyn Fuller is a research associate at the Center for Information Systems and Technoculture at the Waterford Institute of Technology based in Ireland. She is the founder and director of the Solonian Democracy Institute, which seeks to further research and understand alternative democratic practices. Her area of expertise focuses on mass digital participation, ancient Athenian democracy, and money in media and politics.
Yeah, and debating Ms. Fuller today is Samuel Woolley, who is an associate professor of journalism and information and the project director for the Propaganda Research Center at the Center for Media Engagement at the University of Texas at Austin. He previously served as the director of research at the University of Oxford and became the founding director of the Digital Intelligence Lab at the Institute for the Future.
This year's symposium would not have been possible if it weren't for the creativity and resilience of our amazing steering committee. We have been met by some of the most challenging circumstances the International Affairs Symposium has ever faced in its 60-year history. Despite this, our committee showed a level of dedication and positivity that Nathan and I really couldn't have dreamt of. Over the last 4 debates, everything has worked seamlessly, and each session has gone above and beyond our initial vision for this event. This alone could never have been possible without the continued efforts and perseverance of Annika Bateman, Pamela Nazad Atabshirani, Lauren Pavelski, Joshua Phillips, Lauren Pichard, Pablo Quezada Cortez, Milica Stanicic, Maddie Thomas, and Alex Wash. Thank you guys so much for your continued effort, and there they are right outside.
Thanks, guys. We also want to acknowledge our faculty advisor, Bob Mandel, for his continued support throughout this process. Really couldn't have done it without him either. Before we get started here, I just wanted to let our audience today know that if you have any questions during the debate, feel free to put those into the Q&A function of the Zoom webinar. What we're going to be doing is collecting those throughout the course of the debate. And in the final half hour of the session, we'll be asking them to our speakers. So feel free to just go ahead and add those whenever you have them. And then before we get started, I'll just read off a quick description of the debate, and then we'll go ahead and pass things over to Roslyn for your opening remarks. So the digital age has generated innovative technology that is able to transfer information freely and quickly. By 2021, some would argue that the information onslaught presented by modern technology has quickly created conditions in which individuals cannot realistically determine fact from fiction, giving way to a period of technological chaos. Others would argue that widespread access to this unprecedented reservoir of information allows citizens to make more informed decisions than ever before. The question arises, does information overload prevent or enable individuals from being effective participants in society? And Roslyn, I'll turn things over to you for your 20-minute opening statement.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And thank you all for coming out to participate in this discussion today. And also thanks to the organizers for managing to put this all together. So the questions we were asked to answer for this debate are, can individuals be effective participants in society in an age of technological chaos? And does information overload prevent or enable individuals from being effective participants? There's a lot in there. It's about individuals, it's about participation that is effective, and we have some kind of relationship with technology going on, possibly chaotic. So I'm going to deal with all of these very important aspects in the next 20 minutes. But first, let me answer the basic question strongly and unequivocally in the affirmative. Individuals can certainly be effective participants in society in an age of technological chaos. Although to be completely accurate, let me note that we don't live in an age of technological chaos, we live in an age of extreme technological control. The threat to democracy today is not freedom. It's not creativity flowering in 1,000 different directions, some of them, as usual, stupid. The threat is intense control. But despite that, let me affirm again that not only can we be effective participants, which sounds a bit hypothetical, we already are in ways that are absolutely not hypothetical at all. Around the world, millions of people already participate directly in democratic decision-making, and they do so by using technology to process the significant, but not endless, amounts of information required to do that. For example, the 5-Star Movement in Italy has been a leading coalition partner in the national government since 2018, as well as having over 1,000 local councillors and numerous parliamentarians at the European Union. 5-Star members select candidates, they debate policy, they decide on coalition agreements, and they do so by voting online on a platform called Rousseau, which has nearly 200,000 registered members. Other parties, such as Podemos in Spain and various pirate parties, have similar infrastructure. When Podemos leader Pablo Iglesias bought a too expensive home in 2018, he was nearly unseated by his own membership base via an online vote in which 190,000 ballots were cast. People vote online in elections, most notably in Estonia, or as they like to be called, Estonia, which has allowed online voting for almost 20 years, and which runs a highly efficient blockchain-secured civil service database that allows residents to seamlessly access and add to their own data. Estonia estimates that managing information digitally saves 2% of GDP and slashes hours off its weekly government cabinet meetings. If we transferred this to the US, it would mean savings of about $400 billion annually. However, even more relevant are the time savings. Handling information efficiently and communicating digitally allows you to process more information in a shorter time period. This enables decision-making rather than preventing it. Moreover, there are online platforms in Taiwan and Latvia where people are invited to debate motions and vote on resolutions that flow into government decision-making. And there are numerous participatory budgeting projects around the world, many of them online, where citizens and residents directly propose projects and distribute the local budget. These exist in New York, Reykjavik, Nairobi, Paris, the entire country of Portugal, all over Brazil, and recently Seattle. Participatory budgeting in Reykjavik has been going on online for more than a decade, and it's in its 6th year in Paris. Projects like these have allocated tens of millions of dollars worth of funding to public projects. Increased participation and information actually help to clear many of the typical time sinks of effective decision-making. When most people realize that a neighboring ward is receiving less funding per capita and that they don't have amenities they take for granted, they often agree to deal with those problems first. In other words, they truly do become allies in dealing with this unfairness. Similarly, in Brazil, where participatory budgeting was invented, it has often led to increased funding to poor and vulnerable communities, and a reduction in clientelism and corruption. This is important because we spend almost all of our time in conventional media debating things like corruption and spending allocation. Screaming about people's behavior rather than dealing with issues is often erroneously called politics. But noise doesn't necessarily equal information. Surveys show that average people prefer hard facts to opinions in news. And when real people get the chance to participate directly, we often end up with less ink being spilled because we have a little bit of real communication about issues rather than a lot of noise about people. When you focus directly on solving a specific issue, it actually becomes quite easy to make factual assessments. People aren't being asked to make an assessment of the entire world and bring it into some kind of eternally valid ideological order, which no human is capable of doing anyway. They're asked to make a decision on something concrete, like should children have to wear school uniforms, or should masks be compulsory on public transportation? If you think about it, this makes sense. I come from a legal background, and while there's a certain philosophy in law, there is certainly also an impetus to determine what the facts are and to try to create an ordered record of what happened and why. And the platforms I have described work a little bit like this. They create a record as to why exactly a decision was made and what we would call in law the ratio decidendi, the exact reasons the decision rests on. This record can be checked later to see if the outcomes met the expectations. And this is one of the most important ways people determine fact from fiction. They look at whether an action led to an expected outcome. It's kind of like a scientific method for politics. So the issue is not that there is too much information. The issue is that people have no mechanism to test it, discard what turned out to be wrong, set some stuff aside as not relevant to the case at hand, and move on. And that mechanism, the missing mechanism, is what I, as a direct digital Democrat, deal with. It's the democratic hive mind using the scientific method and the results of trial and error to determine probable truth, and it has been working amazingly for hundreds of years now. Now, some people don't want a reasonable way to work through information that allows freedom, allows you to think and express whatever crazy thoughts you have, but just has a way to test them when you're about to make a decision by allowing people to debate and decide directly. Instead, they prefer to just censor everything that they think is dangerous information, and instead of allowing it to be tested, to prevent it from circulating in the first place, and force people to rely on a very limited set of vetted, reliable sources that they control. It's all very Catholic Church, circa 1530. I only have time to deal with a few of these claims here, although I've dealt with many more in my books and other writings. First, there is the claim that people are gullibly taken in by a flood of fake news unique to the digital age. Now, this is a piece of incorrect information that science does not back up. When I was a kid, the National Enquirer and Weekly World News were available at every supermarket checkout in the land, right there in front of your face, just in case you needed to find out what trailer park Elvis was living in. You have Alex Jones? Well, we had David Icke, the 1990s conspiracy theorist who believes that the British royal family are 12-foot-tall lizards. But although things in magazines and on TV carried a lot more authority back then than anything you see on the internet today, and those magazines were published in the millions, they did not actually have much of an impact on society. As cognitive science, and the keyword is science, shows, people are not that easy to brainwash. They are generally hard to convince of new or abstract ideas. They tend to stick with what they know. Despite being high in absolute numbers, the fraction of the population that indulges in such nonsense is low, and it does predate the internet. Let's get on, however, to the example par excellence. The idea that American people didn't really vote for Donald Trump, but that they were brainwashed into doing so by Russian tweets. This is a big part of the fake news affects politics line of thought. So I did what a direct digital Democrat would do. I heard the claim and decided to look at the evidence. One major group that has made this claim is Defending Democracy Together, which claims to have a database of 3 million of these tweets. Now, leaving aside that 80% of the American adult population is not on Twitter, thus unable to see these tweets, and probably 95% of Trump voters aren't, since the platform skews heavily left, and thus probably more people who voted against Trump than for him saw these tweets, and that a lot of the tweets that Defending Democracy Together collected were from after the 2016 presidential election, raising, on top of everything else, the possibility that the Russians have cracked time travel, it is noticeable that many of the highly manipulative tweets said things like, and I quote, Trump, 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 Barcelona, Trump, 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 Trump. Yes, probably a bot. But a bot that's going to make an American voter change their minds. Yet newspapers, the bastions of fact-checking truth, who are going to save us from the internet, reprinted these claims without checking them out. Did they think that somewhere over in St. Petersburg, Russians were sitting around going, hey, Sergey, I had this great idea last night. I mean, look at this tweet. Oh, Alexei, Barcelona, you genius. I was thinking Berlin, London, but no. Trump, 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 Barcelona. How could that not work? I mean, if I, as a Russian, were going to try to think of a way to influence American foreign policy, it would have nothing to do with my arsenal of nukes, my control of a whole lot of oil, my burgeoning relationship with China, or the spaceships we build that get them into orbit. Nor would I send coherent tweets. Nay, I would use this abstract work of art, repeating Trump 17 and a half times with that single Barcelona interspersed there so that American voters in Alabama or North Dakota can sit and contemplate the meaning of that. Don't get me wrong, Russia would benefit from the Western world being in disarray, but they have the same software you guys do. and an organized military, and people who speak fluent English. So whatever this is, it doesn't count as highly sophisticated in Russia either. And to remind you, I am not just picking out one weird tweet here, or even one database of these alleged tweets. There is a claim Russians hacked the election because fake news and the internet. But there is no good evidence to support that claim. In fact, when you track down a lot of the alleged evidence of rampant misinformation, it turns out that it's put out there by venture capital funded companies that sell the services of detecting and controlling misinformation. These claims are often literally straight from their press releases, not from independent research, which again finds that people are pretty good at detecting false information and that they are hard to convince to change their opinions, which is the opposite of gullible. So, another claim that sometimes surfaces is that real participation is impossible because cyberspace is a lawless Wild West. Again, this is completely made up. All the laws that existed before the internet still exist. These include defamation and libel laws, laws against fraud, faking documents, or deceiving people, for example, into entering a contract. Perjury, that is lying before a court, remains punishable. Failure to disclose something on a government document can also be punishable. And there are laws against death threats and harassment because people used to send people death threats before the internet. Lots of these laws deal with electoral offenses, like giving people false information about polling day, or bribing people to vote a certain way, or robocalling. You do something via a bot, you still did it. The attribution of responsibility is a mainstay of law, from being responsible for pets, to minor children, to committing an act while inebriated. The same goes for laws around evidence. If we ever got to a state where people could, for example, fake video so well that it was impossible to distinguish true video from false, which, by the way, is so far not the case, we'd stop using it as evidence. And you can always make more laws. You want to make a law that people can't tweet who they voted for? Go for it. Now, some people might say that the problem is a difficulty enforcing law on the internet. But I draw your attention to the example of Silk Road. And some of you younger ones might wonder, hey, what's Silk Road? And this is my long-awaited chance to say exactly. Silk Road was the US's biggest online crypto run emporium, including, and this is where things went wrong for them, in drugs and allegedly assassins. It only took 2 years for the FBI to take down Silk Road. It took them 20 to catch the Unabomber because he lived off-grid. In many ways, it's easier to catch crime on the internet than in real life. Finally, among the unending stream of these flimsy ideas is the concept that people cannot participate in the modern, technological, information age because they live in filter bubbles where they only hear information they already agree with. Now again, I would first like to point out that all of the platforms I mentioned at the beginning of this speech, like Rousseau and participatory budgeting, make it impossible for people to be in a filter bubble in the first place. It's one platform. There aren't followers, so there aren't cliques. You don't know who you might encounter there. It's not run by Google. But even in the mainstream, corporate-controlled social media sphere, filter bubbles, according to academic research, at best may exist for some small percentage of the most fringe movements. And let's remember, fringe movements aren't dangerous for a system that depends on majority rule, because they're fringe. Massive studies, sometimes involving every Twitter account in a country, show that the vast majority of users interact with a wide range of people and do not mute, block, or unfriend people for political reasons. There is only a tiny percentage of what the British call the chattering classes who do this, and it has led them to have some really nutty beliefs about the way information circulates that I don't believe would have gotten off the ground if they weren't very securely penned into the only filter bubble that actually exists. According to Eli Pariser, inventor of the filter bubble hypothesis, filter bubbles are a danger to invention because, and I quote, combine an understanding of cooking and physics, and you get the nonstick pan and the induction stovetop. But if Amazon thinks I'm interested in cookbooks, it's not very likely to show me books about metallurgy. I'll spare you the details of the discovery of polytetrafluoroethylene, that which makes nonstick pans not stick. But suffice it to say that it involved people with advanced degrees working full-time for major chemical companies. The internet does not have the power to prevent you getting an advanced degree in science and replace that with things you might happen to see on Amazon. Again, according to Pariser. In a personalized world, important but complex or unpleasant issues, the rising prison population, for example, or homelessness, are less likely to come to our attention at all. Unless, of course, you walk on streets or know anyone who went to prison. That's how these things come to most people's attention. If these problems were not problems in real life, they wouldn't be problems. Only the richest of the rich are insulated to such an extent that it's even conceivable that they may not have firsthand experience of these things. Again, this isn't cherry picking. This is what these claims are based on, not science. The science is different. The science's filter bubbles are just made up. So the question I ask myself is, if there isn't really any good reason to doubt that people can handle information, and thus democracy, why are some people trying to create such hysteria about it? I think the reason is that they're panicking, that participation in information is actually getting a lot better, and that a kind of Washington consensus of like-minded editors and think tank associates can no longer take their hegemony for granted. Now, like a cartoon character running away from a fight, they're just trying to throw every possible obstacle in the way of their pursuer. Their arguments continually skip around from vague point to vague point. When you look at the evidence, it doesn't stack up, and often their bald statements don't even have footnotes. In the few instances where they do cite studies, these are usually extremely limited in scope, with a boatload of subjective interpretation going into the results. Rather than creating laws, which are equally applicable and thus democratic, we see a constant urging for tech companies to enforce non-legal standards, which are despotic and subject to change without due process. It's like watching Marie Antoinette claim that peasants aren't hungry. If you want to downside to technology, it's not misinformation and filter bubbles. It's surveillance and lack of privacy, the possibility of a totalitarian state that would make the Nazis look like amateurs. And what we believe to be the downsides of technology really affect our approach to how to deal with it. If you believe that the problem is people and their inability to handle information, then I suppose you would insist on increased control to limit access to that information. You try to get people to install software that detects threats and limits what they see. You try to listen in on Clubhouse and WhatsApp to make sure no one's saying anything that you, in your inherent fallibility, think is incorrect. Treating people as infants when would inevitably infantilize them even more, making them even less educated and less capable. This is one reason why it's important that people do work through and test information, rather than having big companies or the government do it for them. It's because that's the way people learn and grow. We're not supposed to live in a corporatocracy or some deep state robot dystopia. We're supposed to live in a democracy. So the demos, people, need to be in charge of these things. People need to have the power, not other entities. Giving up on that is giving up on democracy. So if an individual effectively participating in politics means dominating others and being able to cut them out of decision-making, then yes, the non-hierarchical tools we use to facilitate decision-making make this more difficult. But if an individual participating effectively means that anyone can put forward an idea, that anyone can speak freely about what they support and why, if everyone has an equal vote and an opportunity to use it, then yes, I say again, individuals can participate effectively in a high-tech society. Indeed, they'll be able to participate more effectively than at any other time in history. And we have shown that we can do this. We have built what we need. You just need to reach out your hand and take it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Fuller. Samuel, if you would like to go ahead with your opening statements, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Roslyn, for that great presentation. It was absolutely excellent. Really enjoyed listening to your points. And I think we both agree that the threat really that exists is the intent to control. I think that where we differ is that I believe that the intent to control has been realized and continues to be realized via technology and particular uses of technology. So I've been studying propaganda and manipulation through digital tools for about 10 years now. And throughout the course of that time, I've traveled and I've spoken to a lot of people who make and build propaganda systems and design propaganda strategies. And I've seen a lot of different things. You know, despite all of this, despite spending time as someone studying propaganda online and manipulation online and the move to control online, I will admit, a reluctant optimist when it comes to the democratic potential of technology. However, the lion's share of research at the intersection of democracy and technology simply does not support the idea that today's technology, particularly social media and network communication tools in their current forms, foster democracy. Quite the opposite. Our many-to-many networked media system was once hailed by academics, journalists, and Silicon Valley alike as a savior of democracy. It has, however, and this is crucial to that control point, quickly been co-opted by political elites, extremist groups, corporations, and a wide variety of other entities for control rather than for liberation. As my friend and colleague Tim Huang, who's the author of The Subprime Attention Economy, says, the marketplace of ideas does not exist online. It doesn't exist on social media because algorithms aren't built to prioritize the best, highest quality information. They're built to prioritize attention and popularity. In its current state, social media and the broader communication technology ecosystem is ill-suited to centering democracy. It must be redesigned with democracy in mind, rather than doing this prioritization for maximized time spent on the platform, time looking at ads, and personal data harvesting and surveillance. Beyond this, we've got to invest in longer-term social programs oriented towards addressing the psychological and affective reasons for polarization and distrust underlying public opinion in many countries around the world. People spread false, manipulative, and hyper-partisan content for many reasons. And a large portion of the push and pull factors include things like alienation, anger, a need to belong, and a need for meaning. So the people that are spreading this content, while they might be a small part of the population, they're able to speak very loudly using social media, and they're fundamentally doing what they do because they believe in it. And that's just one side of things. There's also the whole economy behind this. But beyond this, and what I want to talk about today is sort of the three things at the heart of why today's technology limit people's meaningful participation in society and therefore in democracy. The first is the design of social media tools, the how. The second is the ways in which political actors use those social media tools. And the third is worsening problems regarding ownership of broadcast media, and also serious problems with content and motivations of those same broadcast media. So the first point, right? Social media tools and the algorithms behind them are built to prioritize popularity over truth or quality info when it comes to the content. And popularity can easily be gamed online. We've seen this again and again and again. In fact, over the last several years, we've studied the ways in which not just bots, but also fake human accounts, what we call inorganic content, is prioritized by social media algorithms. Take, for instance, the Parkland shooting. The day of the Parkland shooting, the #1 trending video on YouTube was a video that claimed that David Hogg was a quote unquote crisis actor, which we all know to be fundamentally false. What happens when a very important media system prioritizes a video like that? I'll tell you what happens. You see a cascade effect amongst the broadcast media entities and amongst people across the world. It means that the system that exists is a system where consensus is actually manufactured rather than real, where well-resourced political groups can boost or suppress the numbers in their favor or to limit others' communication. We are seeing propaganda, disinformation, and targeted political hate flowing at rates and in ways never seen before. So the propaganda and the disinformation and the stuff we're experiencing is actually in fact different. Aspiring despots, and this is the second point, use social media in efforts to move towards or to cement authoritarian control in many countries. According to Freedom House, democracy has been declining for the last 15 consecutive years as of 2020. Polity 4 has a similar rank that finds similar things. Many countries once considered established or burgeoning democracies, Brazil, the Philippines, Turkey, Hungary, and many other post-Soviet countries, India, the world's largest democracy, and yes, the United States, have been in decline. And despots have been in power, or wannabe despots have been in power in those countries and have used social media in very meaningful ways to gain power and to stay in power and to attack their opposition and to amplify their own content while suppressing that of others. We've seen a worrying trend, according to both Freedom House and other entities, towards longer or non-existent leader term limits around the world, a less freedom of expression, less rights for migrants, less safety of expats, more ethnic cleansing, less fair and more contested elections. Now onto the third point. There's been a consolidation and more control in media systems driven by more traditional broadcast technology. We see things like 21st Century Fox and News Corp, Televisa in Latin American countries, but also Baidu, Alphabet, and Facebook, which got starts as tech companies rather than media companies, but have now become some of the world's most profitable media companies. In order to understand the problem at hand, we first have to understand the problems that really exist. We have to understand what misinformation and disinformation are and the assortment of other different types of propaganda. Now, misinformation is accidentally spread false content. Everyone spreads misinformation. My grandmother does, my brothers do, I've spread it. Disinformation is about intent. And the point that I'm trying to make to you today is that social media makes it possible for those with the intent to spread false content in attempts to manipulate public opinion actually realize those attempts and actually manipulate public opinion in meaningful ways. And those ways of reaching out to people do not need to be sophisticated. I'm going to touch on that in just a second. So those two things, mis and disinformation, are backed up by these new forms of propaganda. The first is computational propaganda, which is something that my colleagues and I at Oxford have been working on for a while. Computational propaganda is the use of automation, algorithms, and other tools in attempts to manipulate what algorithms show us on social media. I talked to you just a little bit ago about the Parkland shooting and the ways in which videos were prioritized on YouTube that spread falsehoods related to survivors of that shooting. We've also seen similar amplification around the world of particular political events, particular security crises, and particular natural disasters, and especially mis and disinformation related to those disasters. It's true that social media companies have gotten better at detecting bots, but it's also true that there's a move away from bots and towards the use of humans in organic information operations. In fact, China pioneered this. The 50 Cent Army or the Water Army are versions of the same thing that are basically, a group of people that get paid small amounts of money to boost very pro-party content in China in order to game the algorithms that exist in the country in order to prioritize a certain agreement and sort of tacit okayness with what is going on in China. So computational propaganda exists, and it's fundamentally different from the propaganda that came before. We also have network propaganda, which is something that scholars at Harvard have talked about, Yochai Benkler et al. And what they talk about is the fact that along with the digital media systems that exist and prioritize certain kinds of content via amplification, as I've talked about, we also have affective polarization going on due to both those media systems that we've just discussed, the social media, but also due to the broadcast media. So in America, we have a rise in, I mentioned that term, affective polarization. And what affective polarization is basically that it's not necessarily that the center and the left are becoming more polarized. It's that the right is becoming more and more polarized through media entities like Fox News, Breitbart, Newsmax. And that's a big problem. It means that they are fundamentally changing the way that they believe based upon what they're exposed to. And it's not necessarily a direct effects model. In fact, we know as media scholars that you can't study what we used to call the hypodermic needle model and say that when someone watches something, they directly change their behavior. It's more complicated than that. But to say that the research doesn't show that there are some effects is fundamentally false. We know there are effects, but they're probably they're more likely than not secondary or tertiary and not direct. So how does propaganda and disinformation spread differently today than it did yesterday? Well, the first two things are that propaganda today is automated and it's anonymous. The media system today is also fundamentally different. It's a networked media system, not a broadcast media system. That means that many people create the content that we see. It's not a one-to-many system where you have Barbara Walters telling you what news to watch. It's a system wherein almost anyone can create content. And if they have the right tools and if they have the right knowledge, they can get that content to be prioritized in a way that can effectively manipulate public opinion and lead to undue effects online. And that's a major, major problem. So, talking about, say, the Vietnam War or even recent wars in other countries in which we use propaganda, I oftentimes have people say to me, well, we dropped pamphlets over these places and the pamphlets contained a lot of propaganda. Well, what I say to them is, imagine that, but times 10,000 and via a system that we have no insight into. The algorithms are opaque, what people like Frank Pasquale have called black boxes. And so we don't know how the information gets prioritized, and we're beholden to powerful corporations in order to trust that content. Propaganda does not have to be sophisticated to be effective. Propagandists are one thing, if not anything else. They are pragmatists. They use the cheapest tools to get the job done. They are not seeking to change your vote. They aren't really seeking to change your mind in a big way. What they're actually working to do is make you disenchanted, make you apathetic, make you angry. This type of manipulation is in fact at the heart of what we call Russian active measures. This was something that was developed throughout the Cold War with the intent to cause a power vacuum in democracies. And we know it works. There's also a shift towards what we call relational organizing. Now, I've discussed bots and the ways in which they amplify content, but increasingly, propagandists have realized that my botnets are being detected. What can I do in order to make up for that? And so what they've done is they've decided that, okay, well, I will hire what we call micro and nano influencers and pay them small amounts of money to spread my politics. These micro and nano influencers tend to have followers under 20,000 or even 5,000 on a site like Instagram. And they're paid money to spread, say, information on behalf of a particular candidate. They're much more effective at manipulating public opinion because they have closer connections to the people they're trying to manipulate. A bot speaking into the ether might have no effect that you can see on the people around it, but it probably is having effects upon the algorithm. That's the crucial point here. But these nano influencers and micro influencers are having very marked effects upon the psychology of those that they talk to. With the shift to encrypted media spaces and closed messaging systems like WhatsApp, governments like the Indian government under Modi have made great use of this relational organizing in order to manipulate public opinion in a way that is very hidden, because the payments take place off the platforms. And so this is the brave new world that we exist in of inorganic relational organizing and inorganic politics. So the very intimacy of platforms is now being turned against users. It's not just the immediacy, it's also that intimacy. We know that false news spreads faster than scientifically based content. There's an article in Science from 2019 from researchers at MIT that shows just that. We also know that in 2019, 8% of engagement with the top performing news sources on social media was dubious. So 8% of the engagement was with false news sites, or what at Oxford, what they call junk news sites. In 2020, that number doubled to more than 17%, just 1 year and a doubling. And this isn't just happening in the United States. It's easy to talk about the US because we're here talking through Lewis and Clark, but this is also happening in other countries as well. We're seeing similar types of spread of false information via powerful individuals in India, in Brazil, in the Philippines, and a number of other countries. Leaders like Modi, like Bolsonaro in Brazil, like Trump and his supporters that are still in Congress, still in power, along with Duterte, Erdogan, Viktor Orban, and others, use social media in attempts to control the populace. And I think that those attempts are actually really realized these days. And the use broadens it's not only consigned to powerful leaders, but it broadens to other groups. It includes the use by far-right groups in the United States who take a no-holds-barred approach at spreading their messages. Yes, they might be a small majority, but they also caused an insurrection at the US Capitol recently. And we know that they use the internet and tools like Telegram and Signal and WhatsApp and et cetera, I could go on, as fundamental mechanisms for communication and organization. This stuff also gets spread by people that make money, by mercenary propagandists who understand that the internet is a place where you can prioritize certain kinds of content and make a great deal of money off of YouTube videos, particularly since they understand that false videos flow faster than true videos. They're incentivized to actually make more false videos than they are true videos, and they make more money doing that. The last thing that I mentioned is the coalescence of big tech and big media. Everyone's kind of heard about these things to do with antitrust and the fact that Facebook, Google, Amazon, etc. have become so big. Well, that's a massive problem because control is consolidated. It means that these companies control a serious, massive market share, and a market share that is concerned particularly with the flow of information. When the flow of information is controlled, the flow of information is undemocratic. These organizations tend to push people towards polarized viewpoints, again, particularly with the rise of affective polarization in the United States on the right. The systems more and more focus upon division and segmentation and not upon building community or democracy. So the world's largest social media companies like Facebook, like Twitter, YouTube, they are built to put you in a category and advertise particular things to you. Yes, it's true, the research on filter bubbles is out. We do know, however, that homophily, birds of a feather flock together, tends to happen online in unique and interesting ways. The part of the problem here is that we don't have access to data. So to say that the research is bogus misses the point, because what the point that it misses is that the social media companies are holding onto the data so hard and fast that we cannot get any insight into it. Without access to the troves of data that Facebook, YouTube, and the like have, we will not be able to understand the problem, really. So what can we do? There's lots of things we can do, and I hope to get into this in the Q&A. We can actually design technology with democracy and human rights in mind. As I said before, today's technology, the social media systems that we rely on, are not designed with democracy, small d democracy, or the tenets of human rights in mind. They're designed in order to keep you on the platform, to keep your attention, to get you to look at advertisements. What would it look like to design social media with democracy in mind? It's a provocative question. I certainly don't have the answer, but it's a provocative question. We also have to invest in public interest technologists. We have to invest in people that actually understand the ways in which these systems work so that they can actually help the people that are in government understand how to build policy and legislation that actually speaks to the problems rather than being reactionary, rather than being hysterical or chaotic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Woolley. We're a little ahead of schedule, so Roslyn or Samuel, if you'd like to address one another's opening remarks for about 5 minutes, there's time for that if you'd like.
Okay, do you want me to go first then?
Yeah, if you'd like.
Okay, cool. Okay, well, there's a few things there. First of all, this idea that we don't have the answer to how we could have an internet or a digital democracy system that could work on a peer-to-peer basis is just ludicrous. We have millions and millions and millions of people using democracy technology platforms on a peer-to-peer basis around the world, but often we are just criticized, for really no reason, or people will, just refuse to engage with that reality a lot of the time. But it doesn't make it go away. So that's the first point I'd like to make. We do have these tools. We're already using them. But instead of taking advantage of that and supporting people like us who are actually doing those things and have had to do those things at great difficulty to us to do them, we only get these remarks about controlling information and how dangerous information is all of the time. The other thing I'd like to point out is the idea that this is really different. The internet is something different, and information spreads in some unique way to the internet. I just find really, really weird. I've run in elections in Ireland. Everything that goes into that is certainly a no-holds-barred propaganda exercise. So I don't see how the information on the internet is any different than what we do offline all of the time. I'd just like to draw your attention to some historical examples. I lived in Germany for 5 years. The radio, which was new at the time when Hitler took over Germany, is viewed as often quite instrumental to that. Yet Today, people have radios, and no one thinks to themselves, I better not have this radio because it is a tool of propaganda. This is not what's causing propaganda. Ayatollah Khomeini used a photocopier to spread his words around Iran, and he successfully took over Iran. So these are examples in the past where we have a much lower state of technology that people use, that has been used definitely for very extreme political purposes, but we are not worried about this technology today. Finally, in regards to the idea that sensational things spread around the internet faster. Oh yeah, okay, so sensational information spreads faster. Fake things spread faster. Of course they do, because they're sensational and they're weird. And so people go, oh, what's that thing? But that doesn't equate to people believing things. It doesn't mean that they internalize that or that it becomes central to their decision-making process. I mean, I remember when twerking first happened, I started reading about this, twerking that. And I thought, what's twerking? I don't know what this is. I better find out. So I looked it up. But that doesn't mean I have an interest in twerking or I really care. I just had to know what everyone else was talking about. You can't equate a sort of importance of these sites just based on people looking at them. Then one more thing I wanted to say, I think. Oh yes, this idea that that Russia's trying to make people apathetic and angry. That's it. Okay, well, your people in America are apathetic and angry for reasons that don't have anything to do with anything else than the problems in your country. So you had a big Wall Street crash where lots of people lost money, lots of people lost their homes. The people who were responsible for that are pretty clearly identifiable, yet they got off without being punished, and average people were made to pay the price of that. Average people in America cannot go to university, they can't get a good education, and therefore, you just use that as an excuse for them not to have a life. You don't have basic healthcare for your own citizens. And people understandably are unhappy living this way. They're understandably very angry. And now you are saying, well, you're not really apathetic and you're not really angry. You're just an idiot. And you think that way because of Russians. You don't have anything to be angry and apathetic about. So these problems have nothing to do with the internet. They have everything to do with the underlying issues in your country that if you don't deal with, may well cause major problems in your country at some point, not very far in the future. But it won't be because people talked about it on the internet. It'll be because they happened in real life.
Happy to respond. So it's true, millions of people do use democratic technology systems. And it's true that they can use them to vote and they can use them to, in some ways, meaningfully participate in micro ways. But it's also true that they are doing this in controlled governmental systems much of the time. The Five-Star Party in Italy was mentioned. We know, for instance, the data shows it, that the Five-Star Party former leader, Beppe Grillo, has used amplification tactics to push his content to the top of Twitter and to the top of other social media sites. So simultaneous to these parties using democratic communication systems, which are operating on a micro scale, they're using macro level technology systems in order to spread dis and misinformation, which then gets recirculated via network propaganda, via the social media system, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and then flies onto broadcast technology. So it's a vicious cycle. It's like the worm eating its own tail, right? You don't know where it starts and ends, and that's part and parcel to it. Brazil was also mentioned. Brazil, one of the BRICS countries, was people saw it as very hopeful. Bolsonaro is in power in Brazil and is using social media in a very, very hateful, controlling way. In fact, in Brazil, they call the office within the government that works to manipulate social media and to harass citizens the Office of Hate. And so these systems, these countries and people in these countries are able to use these democratic systems. And I wish that the democratic systems that they have on technology would be further realized. But the fact of the matter is they are far outshined by the much larger technological systems that are in control, the monopolies, the companies that we are worried about and that we should file antitrust suits against. Now, features of the internet are markedly different from legacy media. Yes, it's true that the printing press, for instance, was used by the Catholics and the Protestants to spread propaganda after its creation. Books were flowing like wildfire. But the flow of books and people's ability to read a book is a lot different than people's ability to read viral disinformation or false content that flows on a site like Twitter or Facebook, which can spread around the world in seconds, less than seconds. We know that this stuff has effect. We know that it spreads very quickly. And you know, this idea that people don't believe the sensational content that we know does spread very quickly on social media sites, that's bogus. What about QAnon? QAnon has basically become a popular movement. It was once a fringe movement, but now has been picked up, according to the research data, by people in a wide variety of communities. Mommy bloggers, people that are interested in yoga, anti-vaxxers have been able to coalesce around this conspiracy-driven movement that was fostered and formed online. Donald Trump used Twitter a great deal. It was his favored mechanism of manipulation, of spreading communication. And a lot of people in this country, as my opponent pointed out, believed in Donald Trump. They voted for him. And they continue to believe in the lies that he told about the election via social media that were amplified through those tools. We cannot decontextualize, finally, the problems that exist in the United States currently with polarization, yes, to do with problems that exist in our financial system, with historical antecedents like the Cold War, which went on for the better part of a century. The Cold War, we know, pushed the United States to the right. And certainly we can accept fault and work to figure that out. But the thing is, Russia worked to manipulate public opinion during that time in the same way that the United States worked to manipulate public opinion abroad during that time too. And so the informational systems were fundamental then, they become more fundamental now. And as they currently exist, these technologies, social media and other emerging media technologies, are not built with democracy in mind. They do not prioritize the participation of the individual in a meaningful way.
Great, thank you too for those excellent remarks. At this point, we're going to go ahead and bring in our debate moderator, Professor Tung Yin, who is a professor of law here at the Lewis and Clark College Law School. He specializes in national security law and has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Associated Press, just to name a few. Professor Yin, I'll hand things over to you now.
Great, thank you. And thank you to the committee for inviting me to moderate. It's actually been a few years since I've been able to do this, and it's always great to be involved with the upper campus, as we call it. Professor Mandel's instructions to me in the past have always been basically don't emphasize agreement, emphasize as much disagreement as possible, which I think I don't really need to do. That last back and forth bit already highlighted the big difference. So I just see my job here as further widening the difference in views between Professor Woolley and Ms. Fuller. So my prior is just to lay them out. This isn't particularly my area of research, but where there is sort of an intersection is information warfare. So my natural inclination is to view information as something that is valuable and important, but can be used either to attack offensively in the sense of better target selection, or to mislead the other side. So in some ways, let me put this out as an analogy. Information and the ability to both access it and the ability to post it through social media and others is like a gun. A gun is a tool. It can be used defensively for positive purposes, self-defense, and so forth. And it can be used in very negative ways to commit crimes. And it strikes me that both of you are taking the view that information is important, but in the case of Ms. Fuller, you are seeing the very positive aspects of this ability to access and post, and essentially the ability of the public to discern and discriminate between useful and useless information. And Professor Woolley, you're viewing it more in the concern of all the bad things that can happen to it. So let me just throw out a few concepts and see how it is that the two of you would maybe consider how these factor into your respective views. One of them is heuristic biases. there are a lot of heuristic biases that people have, and especially the irrational economists have figured out that one of those is the resistance that people have to information that counters their beliefs, and compared to their great acceptance of information that confirms their beliefs. And so I wonder how that plays into one's view of whether this easy access is good or bad. Second thing is deliberate ignorance, which Elias Soman at George Mason has written a lot about in terms of politics. It's true that there's a lot of information out there that people can access and learn much more about the issues they're voting on, and that's very much a positive. But whether people actually will go to the effort of acquiring that information is a different point. And so we see things like straight ticket voting, where instead of actually having to check each candidate, you could just check the Democratic or Republican box and poof, you're done with voting right away. You check one box, and so it spares people the effort of having to gather information. Maybe this makes sense. If you are a Democrat and you think that the Democratic candidates are going to support the values you want, why bother researching? But it means people aren't looking for the information, even though it is out there. One thing I used to do when I was in California, one of the elected offices is the state controller. And I would just ask my friends, do you know what the state controller does? And people were vaguely like, isn't it connected to the treasury or something? And then I would say, well, what's the difference between what the controller does and what the state treasurer does? And a lot of people didn't know. And yet we're voting on these offices. People could find out, well, was this pre-internet? I mean, you just read the ballot booklet. But people don't necessarily do that. So deliberate ignorance, what role does that play in terms of the value of information? And then the final observation is it strikes me that, again, the two of you are taking opposite views on this essentially First Amendment marketplace of ideas theory. And again, the traditional marketplace of ideas is that, hey, you know what? We don't need to censor things. We should have that the solution to bad information is bad speech is more speech. Point out what's wrong with what the other side is doing. But there's discontent with the First Amendment marketplace of idea theory. So I guess I would see that maybe as like a final point of debate between the two of you. So I'll stop here, and I just am curious how the two of you see these 3 points as maybe affecting your views of the availability of information, both accessing and posting.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'd first like to point out that technically I also have a PhD, so, you know, if Professor Woolley is Professor Woolley, then I guess I'm Dr. Fuller.
Dr. Fuller, okay, I didn't know.
Lecturer, which I think is the same as your assistant professor, but, you know, I just find it something that comes up a lot. Okay, so taking all of these points. Okay, so let's start with deliberate ignorance. I think the issue is that I would also say that the current system we have, the electoral system we have, is not an ideal system. In fact, it wasn't even intended to be democracy. It was intended to be a republic. That's what the founding fathers said about the system they were trying to create. They would frequently say it's not supposed to be a democracy. So this system of elections does create a lot of problems. I've written quite extensively on this. And I think this is kind of at the root of your question about deliberate ignorance, because people just need to vote once every 4 years. And then, of course, they can just vote Democrat or Republican as they want. Now, part of that has to do with asking yourself, what is the, as I said, kind of the ratio decidendi, like the bottom point of your decision? What is really motivating you? Often people are motivated by 1 or 2 issues. So they don't feel like they need to look into every little side issue. Sometimes even when I'm voting, I think that something like tax policy is very, very relevant. And that is kind of like the most important reason for why I vote the way I do. So that's one thing, is that it doesn't necessarily mean they don't know why they're voting or they don't have a clue about it. It just may mean that they've reached a point where they have something that's so important to them that they want to keep going with that. However, something that we have here, but that you don't have in the US on a national level, are of course referendums. I have lived in Ireland for about 15 years. I think in that time there have been at least probably close to a dozen referendums. So when we do that, we are focusing very, very much on the issue rather than just this top line information of what party you want to vote for. And I think that helps elucidate a little bit more what people want to do with these specific issues. And I mean, that's the kind of thing we do as digital Democrats, as we focus on forums, if you want to call them that, or decision-making processes that focus on that issue-specific decision-making, rather than, as I kind of said in my speech, like this screaming about candidates or screaming about who did what, about screaming, you know, who's corrupt and who isn't, that actually doesn't really get you anywhere anyway. So I think it's understandable that a lot of people tune that out. We do find that when you focus on issues, people do become quite locked into those issues. And start to think a lot more about information, but you do need a lot of it. It can't just be like once every 4 years. It should really be a lot more continuous, you know. And I think that our system that has referendums, or for example, the Swiss system that has referendums, does a much better job of that. When it comes to resistance to information that changes your beliefs, I think this is a really funny one. Because, for example, I've been pro-choice all of my life, or you know, since I was a teenager anyway. And sometimes I say to people, you know, when people say, you know, people need to be more open to changing their beliefs, I say, well, yes, you're right. You know, we should go down to the Catholic Church and we should really listen to what the priests have to say about being pro-life. You know, I mean, you don't know, we might want to change our minds. And perhaps we should volunteer at an abortion clinic, because unless we're willing to do this, do we really have the conviction of our beliefs, you know, or is it just a shallow thing that we have? And people react very, very allergically to that, because there's this idea that people are, you know, resistant to information that contradicts their beliefs, but it's only supposed to go one way. You know, the moment you suggest that it should maybe go the other way, and maybe we should consider all of these things, like, you know, maybe we should be pro-life, maybe there's a point to that, maybe women shouldn't work out of the side of the home, you know, maybe, you know, this, that, and the other thing, suddenly people really lock up and we don't want to reconsider that. So it cuts all different ways. I think that, yes, people are resistant to information that counters their beliefs, but of course they've also usually formed their beliefs for some reason or other. So it's very unlikely that you're going to come up with a piece of information that counters their belief. You know, I mean, it's usually based on like their lived experience or their deeply held beliefs, possibly even religious beliefs. So then the First Amendment, I'm not a fundamentalist on this point. We do have more restrictive speech laws than you do in Europe, generally speaking, than you do have in the United States. So I'm open to restrictions by law, because that is something that is equally applied. That's something that counts for everyone. But I would not be open to restriction by a social media giant, which I think is a lot more concerning. You know, if people in a country decide we want to restrict the speech for this or that reason, as for example is restricted in Germany, fine, go for it. But get that passed democratically rather than, you know, kind of imposed by a social media giant.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Fuller, and thank you, Professor Yin. Great points, great questions. I'm excited to talk about these for just a couple minutes here. I've been asked to keep this short. So I like that analogy, Professor Yin, about info and ability to access it being like a gun. I want to make a point though here, like, you know, design of technology matters. So guns are designed with a particular idea in mind, right? They're designed to shoot things. The internet is designed to, you know, fundamentally to share information. That's why they call it the information superhighway. The thing about social media and the current technology that we have is that it is not designed to prioritize democratic viewpoints or human rights or things like that. It's designed to prioritize advertisements. It's designed to get people to stay on the platform. And it's designed in a way that doesn't factor in nuance. It factors in control. Who is able to use these systems and who is able to manipulate them matters. And what we've been shown over the last 10 years is that despots or wannabe despots, the ones that I've mentioned, are able to fundamentally control these systems through various mechanisms. They can game the algorithms, we know this. The question about heuristic biases is an interesting one. And I like, you know, the nod towards irrational economics, and I'd also point out that psychologists and psychiatrists have seen the same thing. Back in January of last year, I wrote a paper for the National Endowment for Democracy that was called The Demand for Disinformation. And we talked about all the reasons, all the drivers of why people consume this content. And we talked exactly and precisely about things like the belief perseverance effect. We talked about the bandwagon effect. And we found that these things existed. We used case studies in Macedonia, case studies in Mexico, and original research. And we discovered that it's true. People online and people offline are given to sticking to their beliefs. The problem with the system as it exists is it's not built to challenge pre-existing beliefs. Remember what I said earlier about how there's a shift towards relational organizing on the internet? There's a shift towards attempting to use personal connections to manipulate people. Ask yourself this question: how do beliefs get changed? The answer to it, according to the psychological research, is by talking to people you care about. And so this shift towards relational organizing online is actually more effectively pushing people towards believing disinformation and propaganda, because it's being spread by people who they actually believe in and trust these days. We knew that it had an effect before when it was being spread by bots and sock puppet accounts, but to a lesser extent, we know that it has more of an effect now. The last thing is this question about a couple things. The thing about the marketplace of ideas. In the same way that rational economics doesn't play out, neither does the marketplace of ideas in our current media system. People are not able to find the best quality information because they exist in a deluge of content. They also exist in a system where the most powerful, well-resourced actors are able to prioritize content that most benefits them in order to manufacture consensus. I mean, this is very much along the lines of what Herman and Chomsky were talking about, but in the social media era. How do beliefs get changed? Remember, through the people you care about, but also through other mechanisms as well. And so constant exposure to information is also a huge factor here. And people are on social media across the world in a big way. And that's a problem as it currently exists.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fuller and Professor Woolley. We'll move on to the Q&A section at the moment. And thank you, Professor Tung for your amazing commentary and remarks. We have a lot of questions and we're going to try to get through as much as we can. So if we can keep responses to as limited as we can, we have amazing questions. So we'd like to get through them. To start, this one's to Dr. Fuller, but we'll have Professor Woolley respond to hers. Algorithms used by social media companies tailor content to what an individual wants, acting as a pseudo-unseen filter bubble. Mark Zuckerberg contextualized this best when he claimed, "A squirrel dying in front of your house may be more relevant to your interests right now than people dying in Africa." How can this technology, which has also catalyzed and enabled the ethnic cleansing of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, be incorporated into society in a beneficial way?
Okay, so thanks for the question. First of all, unfortunately, I would say what Mark Zuckerberg says is not incorrect. If there's a squirrel dead on your front lawn, you have to go out and deal with it. I'm not quite sure what you particularly are going to get out and do over someone dying in Africa. You know, if you want to find that information, you can. But I haven't met anyone who's like, yes, I've saved a person's life in Africa because of something I randomly read on the internet. Like, the relationship here between internet and reality doesn't really seem to be coming through, you know? You have to go out and do things in reality in order to affect reality. Just seeing things on the internet does not do that on its own. So that's one thing. I mean, as far as something like ethnic cleansing goes, okay, I mean, I'm from an international law background. I mean, we've been dealing with this for decades and decades and decades. Incitement to genocide is a crime, okay? It's a major crime. It's a crime that will get you held before the International Criminal Court. So what we do, however, is we don't argue online that, you know, maybe it's not okay for you to kill people. We go out and grab people and haul them before a court and put them in jail. Like, that's how you have to deal with these issues. So there will always be like psychopaths and narcissists, you know, forever. There have been forever. If you look back through history, they've always been there. You have to kind of combine, I guess, your laws and enforce your laws, but you can't enforce them on the internet. You have to enforce them in real life. So this is the issue. I think these things where this idea that you're going to change things just by acting on the internet is completely off base. You're going to have to change things in real life. The end.
Yeah, Professor Woolley, if you'd like to respond.
Yeah, maybe I'll respond to the second part of the question about how this technology can be incorporated in society in a more beneficial way. I think that, you know, the way I think about this is in terms of questions of design, in terms of how the questions of use. So if the technology is designed in such a way that it prioritizes democratic content, or it makes people intake more sort of diverse information, so like more of like an omnivorous news diet, then, you know, perhaps it's possible that it could lead people to being more educated, more critically aware. And this could, you know, potentially lead to more democratic systems. So one of the things that I've argued in the past, including in my last book, The Reality Game, is that we need to think about designing new social media systems for democracy. And we need to make it very clear to the VCs in Silicon Valley why this is beneficial to society. Put it in marketing terms, like people do not like to be lied to. And so why not build a system that actually prioritizes democratic content? Maybe you'll find that you're able to sell more stuff. I don't know. And so you know, the other thing is that in order to have a society that's able to use the tools in beneficial ways, it's kind of like a cat and mouse game. This is not just a short-term fix. We can't just plan to redesign the tools overnight. That's going to take a long time. We also have to make sure that we invest in media literacy, information literacy, a la Dana Boyd and a la people that have said, hey, listen, passively checking fake news or false news and saying, hey, you're wrong, actually doesn't really work very well. In fact, it actually cements views that have already been sort of cemented online. And so we've got to think about ways in which we work directly with the affective reasons that people believe this stuff, this underlying psychological reasons. And also we've got to take away these systems that exist for leaders to be able to game algorithms like the Myanmar government did. Right now, those with the most money can game the systems. We saw it happen through Facebook groups with the government of Myanmar, the military dictatorship. And this will continue to happen until fundamental changes are made to the platform. Right now, they haven't been made, and that's a huge, huge problem for democracy.
Great, thank you both for those responses. We're going to move on to a new question now, and for this one, we'll have you start, Professor Woolley, and then Dr. Fuller can respond. This question is, to what extent is the recent Capitol insurrection along the exponentially growing fracture among American citizens a sign of healthy democracy? Is this an abnormality of the digital age, or is this something we can expect to see as the new normal?
I think that you can't really extricate the 2021 Capitol insurrection from the use of digital tools. Groups like the Proud Boys, the non-monolithic entity known as the alt-right, the Oath Keepers, all of these groups have been made, built, organized, and communicated online. They use online tools like Gab, Rumble, and a number of other ones that I've mentioned over the course of this conversation as a mechanism to organize and communicate. And the thing about them is they take a no holds barred approach. So whereas grassroots movements or democratic organizations might be unwilling to spread lies or falsehoods or use amplification tactics, the people that I've just mentioned are very much willing to do this. And yes, it is historically contextual. It's tied to the Lee Atwaters of the world, the people that were part of the Republican infrastructure in the 1980s that basically made a decision that we are going to get our candidate into office at all costs. We're going to get what we want at all costs. And that means lying. That means misusing the media system. And these groups that were involved in the 2021 Capitol insurrection have continued to manipulate the social media system for their own benefit. I wrote a paper with the German Marshall Fund on Gab, looking at the spread of anti-Islamic content. And we found that a tremendous amount of that anti-Islamist content was then spread on Facebook and YouTube to more popular audiences. And so the idea of these people isn't just to keep it in the family and spread it between themselves. It's to incubate this content on those fringe platforms and then spread it to the masses via the bigger platforms.
Okay, again, I can only say, I just don't see what this has to do with the internet. I mean, when I was a teenager, 900,000 Tutsis were murdered in Rwanda. They didn't have the internet, had nothing to do with the internet. You know, we let it happen. The idea that white supremacy or lying or anti-Islamic content is remotely related to the internet, I find really, really, really weird. I mean, white supremacists have been around all of our lives. They probably peaked in the 1920s in the US when the Ku Klux Klan had 4 million members. Anti-Islamic content, well, that spiked during the War on Terror, okay? And that came a lot from government, and it came from people close to that. It didn't just appear out of nowhere. Okay, that was something, and it also didn't appear on the internet because most people weren't on the internet back then. So that's something as well. You've had America, you've had a civil war, you've had all kinds of rebellions. People don't have rebellions because there is the internet. They have rebellions, or they have maybe ideas that are also can be extremely destructive, obviously, not because people are able to talk about it on the internet, but because that dissatisfaction and that polarization exists in the society, usually for reasons that go back for decades, not for something that is happening out of convenience. So this idea that if things weren't convenient, they would be better, it would be too much trouble to do this, just really isn't borne out by history. We've been living this history for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and if you go back 2,000 years, you can see people having basically the same arguments as they are today. So it doesn't matter if you're like chiseling on a piece of stone, you're going to end up more or less in these same political arguments. It's not really leading to anything particularly evil and bad about the internet.
Just if I might respond, so this is an interesting point, and I completely agree that of course these things have happened in the past. Of course there has been ethnic cleansing in the past. Of course there's been civil war. Of course hate groups existed, but that does not mean that the internet and the use of the internet, not just the internet, it's the use of the internet, can markedly change the way these groups get formed, the rates at which they get formed, the spread and speed of disinformation. And so my point is that this stuff is changing in a way that is very concerning. It's increasingly rapid and difficult to respond to, and looks very different both qualitatively and quantitatively.
I really don't think what happened is worse than the genocide in Rwanda. And people...
No one's saying that, though.
Yeah, well, you are saying that it's rapid and harder to respond to, yet there was a genocide in Rwanda that everyone totally watched happen practically in real time. People could have responded. It was the will to respond that was missing, and quite apart from that, I mean, yes, you can talk to people more rapidly on the internet, but like I can file my taxes more rapidly. I can talk back more rapidly on the internet. The speed of life has increased over, the centuries, but it has increased for everybody. We can also drive around in automobiles now. I mean, so what?
If we could interject here, I think we're going to go ahead and move on to a new question. Thank you both for that nice exchange there, and it's good to have good diverse perspectives on display at the symposium.
Yes, we're having a great time. This one is to Dr. Fuller, and we would love to have Professor Woolley answer to her response right after. You say that more laws can be made to address the speed of disinformation online, but no such law has been made to address the bias of social media algorithms toward information that gets reactions rather than information that is true. Considering this, how can individuals be expected to make informed decisions when they believe they are receiving complete information, but in fact are not?
Okay, well, why would you believe you're receiving complete information? Like, I mean, did God come down and tell you it? I mean, you have to make judgments. I'm sorry, you have to do that. You have to stand on your own feet. You have to sort through information, and you have to make a judgment call about what you think is probably not true, okay? Because even courts don't say this is true. They say this is beyond reasonable doubt. We don't know. We're not gods. We don't know what is true. We make a judgment call on what we think is probably true, or at least, seems to be all right based on what we know. But we have to always be ready also to revise that. So, you see a tweet. Okay, is that it? You're going to base your whole life on one tweet? I mean, in the past, did I read one newspaper article and base my whole life on that one newspaper article? Or did I keep reading? Did I read a little bit every day, for years and years and years and years and years? That's how you decide things. So if you want to say, I want to be in a dependency relationship where I depend on something to deliver me, the truth or what I should be doing, then you're going to be sorely disappointed because no one has your interests in mind like you do. So don't trust anybody and don't depend on them. Look at things yourself. And you will find many things that are incorrect and many things that are lies, but such is the nature of the world, and that's not going to change.
Yeah, I guess my response is, I completely agree that algorithms are built to prioritize, bad quality and manipulative content. And I think that, the nuance that we have to unpack here is the fact that the media system looks markedly different these days, right? Back in the day, historically, maybe you read books, you could watch the TV anchor, you could listen to the radio. The immediacy at which people get information today matters. People develop their identities through these media systems. This is how they learn, right? There was this idea early on in the internet that everyone would have this amazing access to information. They could go to any library, they could read any book nearly. Well, we knew that the corporations would make that impossible eventually via the law of copyright, but that wasn't realized. Research showed that people, when they went online, they accessed the same 5 sites over and over and over again. Not everyone accessing the same 5 sites. Each of us had our own 5 sites we access, right? And so what that speaks to is this idea that the way that people get their information matters. And the way that people get their information has changed. And algorithms do curate content to people. Social media companies are fond of saying we're not the arbiters of truth. That is fundamentally false. They absolutely arbitrate the truth to people. They tell people what is worth looking at versus what is not looking at. And that has an effect upon the way people form their political beliefs and their identities.
If I can just jump in, I mean, we don't, the things, you keep saying no one develops a better way of doing democracy. We have developed that. We do this. No one in their right mind would think that a corporate controlled company is going to lead to some kind of amazing freedom and that they have your best interests at heart and that everything's going to be sunny and wonderful. Like nobody thinks that. So we create our own things that are not, corporate controlled and aren't dependent on advertising and don't have blue check marks. We've already created these systems. So I don't understand why you're so insistent on relying on something that was never fit to fulfill this purpose anyway. But at the same time, now you want to censor it, and bring it down and control it. I mean, who cares? The world, people have freedoms. The world is going to keep going the way it is. You develop a better tool where those abuses can't happen. It's not complicated.
Great, thank you both so much. We're going to move on to our next question, and we have about 10 minutes left, so we'll try to get through 1 or 2 more here. Our next question is addressed to you, Professor Woolley. You've spoken a lot about the far-right movement in the United States and how they've been empowered by social media. Do you have anything to say about the far left? Do they not use the same strategies and techniques? Have we not seen outcomes comparable to the Capitol riot in the streets of the US led by leftist groups?
I think there's always this desire to say that, we're seeing this on the right, so are we seeing it on the left? I would point you to the book Network Propaganda and the fact that it speaks exactly to this point. And what it shows that fundamentally speaking in the United States, the right uses these tools and tactics a lot more than the left does in this society. That being said, it's absolutely the case in other countries that leftists or people that style themselves as socialists have made use of these tools in order to manipulate public opinion as well. I can think of a couple good examples. One would be Duterte in the Philippines. He has absolutely used these tools in similar ways in order to set himself up as sort of a very controlling leader. Another example would have been the former leader of Ecuador, Rafael Correa. He also styled himself as a socialist and also made use of these exact same tools. When it comes to the protests that we've seen in places like Portland, where Lewis and Clark is, and the ways in which these organizations use this content, we just haven't seen the same spread of disinformation and automated or sock puppet driven or influencer driven inorganic information flows. We've definitely looked for it. We've seen some of it, but it disproportionately skews toward the right side. It's not a right or left question. It's a culturally contextual and country contextual problem, right? So in the United States, the right uses it more. In Ecuador, we've seen the left use it. In the Philippines, we've seen the left use it, and so on.
Yeah, okay, well, I didn't look into this. I just actually one day started researching into democracy organizations, and actually I found an enormous network of hundreds of organizations funded by like Piero Midyar and the Knight Foundation and Illuminate. And these organizations that employed all kinds of people actually were using a lot of these kind of network tools to sort of get their oar in there. And I don't know if they really have a lot of support either in the, in the grassroots community, so to speak, since usually the people who work for them are paid to work for them. So I've seen a lot of that going on as well. It's not just one side or the other. It is indeed both sides. And I mean, I've seen people, people comment on Twitter as well, like in the UK after the Brexit vote. I mean, Remainers would repeatedly wish that old people would die because they were Brexit voters, or, they would celebrate when they died. It was really disturbing to see that. But it definitely happened, and most of those people would consider themselves left and progressive. So, I mean, unfortunately, you can't really claim that one side or the other is better. I think the important thing is to create a process that is fair and a process that everyone can use.
Thank you very much. This question is directed to Professor Woolley as well, and Dr. Fuller, we would love if you responded again. To what extent are real online grassroots movements subverted by actors with an agenda?
All the time. I mean, this happens all the time, all around the world. You have what's called grassroots movements. You also have what's called Astroturf movements, right? Fake grassroots. In the last 10 years of studying this stuff, what we've seen is the attempt to spread disinformation, which is the purposeful spread of false content, and get it to metastasize into misinformation, which gets accidentally spread by these groups. So the goal is to spread this purposefully false content or purposefully harassing or inciting or hateful content and get regular people to pick it up and spread it as quickly as possible. We call it seeding and fertilizing. They seed the content amongst, say, Facebook groups, and then they attempt to prod people in the right direction towards the hateful idea or towards a disinformative idea. And oftentimes it results in a true takeover of groups. It's not just also that, like, this is a tactic or strategy that we see used by propagandists or people in power. It's also that it's a technological thing, right? Like we've found in the past in India and Brazil in our research that that groups on Facebook have been bought or sold by various political groups. So one example is the page of a very famous cricketer in India, which had millions of followers, and one day suddenly started spewing very far right content. And everyone was sort of like, why, what's going on? And they found out that it had been sold to a far right group with the intention of manipulating opinion on that site. What we found quantitatively is that when this happens, when those sites get sold or when the content gets spread on those sites in a way that is like, not true to cricket or not true to the cat videos that we want to share or whatever, that people actually don't leave those groups. It showed the research shows that the people stay on the groups and they stay and they actually engage and continue to consume the information.
Okay, well, again, of course, you can take over a group, but we used to see this all of the time also offline as well. The government often used to send people to infiltrate groups. Other people could, of course, infiltrate them as well, or you would have frequent fights to take over even a party. So that would also be a big thing. In fact, this happened in the labor movement in the UK just recently. There was a big movement for people to join the Labour Party and take it over and make Corbyn the candidate. That wasn't something that just happened. That was like planned for years, actually, for people to join the Labour Party and take it over. So these kinds of takeovers, or even hostile takeovers, if you want, can happen all of the time. But yeah, can you do this? Sure. And that's why, again, when we set up a direct digital decision-making platform, we have real people only allowed to participate. You can verify that you only have real natural persons participating. This gets rid of a lot of these problems. And why wouldn't you? I mean, corporations aren't allowed to vote. Fake people aren't allowed to vote. So only people who are allowed to vote should participate.
Excellent. We're going to move on to one final question. For this one, if you guys could just keep your responses brief. We're just running out of time here. And we thank you both again for your thoughtful contributions. So this question is addressed to both of you. In this discussion about the digital age and democracy, we need to address the attack on journalists and government whistleblowers in democracies, like Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning, and Edward Snowden, and their revealings of corruption. Should we be afraid of them as the government and mass media wants us to? What should that fear tell us about ourselves? At what point does censorship violate both domestic and international freedom of speech? Dr. Fuller, if you'd like to respond first.
Oh yeah, you go. I'm totally behind you. Yeah, no, absolutely. Like Julian Assange, for example, I mean, they have revealed, when people reveal things that are the truth, there's often this tendency to, blame them and even to say, they've made us look bad. But the truth hurts, we always have to look at the information we have, regardless of the source of that information. I think they do a very good job. I mean, if Julian Assange was blowing the whistle in Russia or China, he would be lauded in the US. It's only because it's this way around that he is criticized. The US isn't much different than the countries it criticizes. For those of us who aren't from there, it all looks, I'm not going to say completely equivalent. I'm definitely a person from a Western society, but at the same time, it's not as different as people would like to believe. I think this is it's not unexpected, I mean, that someone would come in for such a difficult time, having blown the whistle, and Chelsea Manning, you mentioned as well, who blew the whistle on war crimes. I mean, this isn't surprising. This always happens. It is scary, but I think it's very important that we support them and that we show our support. And I think it's actually very encouraging, because I actually originally thought that Chelsea Manning would go to jail for a lot longer than she did. So I was actually quite encouraged that didn't last that long, and that Obama actually made some changes as well based on the revelations that Snowden brought out as well. So I think that things are actually improving quite a lot, and that people are a lot more open-minded. And I think that Americans, who are actually really, really good people, I really like Americans because they're so positive, and I think Americans do want to do a lot of good in the world. And I do think that if you're fully aware of what you're doing, I do think that you will make the right decisions as a country, and I think this is an important step towards that. So it's been quite encouraging to me, even though it's kind of scary and like a bumpy ride, and it's a little bit nerve-wracking, but I think we're coming out all right in the end.
Sure. I mean, I agree. The fact that governments attack these journalists is atrocious and problematic. And fearing information is never a good idea. I would say that to add to the list, we have Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden. I would also remind people of Jamal Khashoggi and Maria Ressa, who is in the Philippines and has been arrested, I believe, around 10 times at this stage. Both of those journalists and the other people that we have mentioned here have been attacked and defamed and harassed, and mis and disinformation has been spread about them through social media. We know that press freedom is on the decline around the world, including in the United States. And this is a problem. We also know that journalists are often some of the key targets of manipulation campaigns online. There's a report we did a while back called State-Sponsored Trolling, and it looks into the ways that governments leverage social media in order to attack the opposition. And again and again and again, across both democracies and authoritarian states, we found that it was journalists that were often the primary targets. And this is for good reason, right? Because they are attempting to give us good quality information.
Thank you very much. And before I allow Nathan to make the closing remarks, I wanted to personally apologize to both Dr. Fuller and Dr. Woolley for miscommunicating the titles of your names. We want to support and uplift anybody who gets a doctorate, and especially a female in the field. So on behalf of the school, I apologize for that.
Yeah, wow, Samuel, Woolley, Roslyn, Fuller, amazing job. That brings the 59th International Affairs Symposium to a close. We thank you so much for being here, our audience and our speakers. Yeah, wow, it's been great. And we're gonna sign off now. Speakers, if you could please stick around for like 5 more minutes. Our media team has a couple questions. And audience members, we'll see you all next year in person for the International Affairs Symposium. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.